The Miller family moved into the old farmstead on a crisp autumn afternoon. John and Sarah Miller had been searching for a place to start fresh, somewhere away from the bustle of city life. Their children, Emily and Ben, were eager to explore the wide-open spaces that surrounded their new home. The farm was quaint, with a 2-story farmhouse that creaked with age and a barn that stood tall and proud against the backdrop of rolling hills. It was only when they ventured further into the property that they stumbled upon the remains of the original barn. Hidden behind the newer, sturdier structure, the charred ruin stood as a silent sentinel, a stark reminder of a past tragedy. Its blackened beams jutted out like skeletal fingers, and the air around it felt colder, heavier. "Look at this," John said, pointing towards the ruins. His voice was filled with a mix of curiosity and unease. Sarah stepped closer, her eyes widening as she took in the sight. "What do you think happened here?" "Fire, most likely," John replied. "Old barns like these were prone to them. Probably happened a long time ago." Emily, the older of the 2 children, shivered despite her thick sweater. "Can we go back to the house? This place gives me the creeps." Ben, ever the adventurous 8-year-old, poked at the ground with a stick. "I think it's cool, like something out of a ghost story." John ruffled his son's hair. "Let's head back. We've got plenty of time to explore later." As they walked back to the farmhouse, the sun dipped lower in the sky, casting long shadows across the yard. That night, as they settled into their new home, the Millers felt a sense of peace and contentment. The farmhouse, with its cozy rooms and rustic charm, felt like a haven. But as the wind howled outside, carrying whispers that seemed to seep through the walls, Sarah couldn't shake a feeling of unease. She lay awake, listening to the creaks and groans of the old house, trying to convince herself that it was just the house settling. In the days that followed, it began the arduous task of turning the farm into a thriving homestead. John repaired fences and tended to the fields, while Sarah cleaned and organized the house. Emily and Ben explored their new surroundings, finding hidden nooks and crannies that sparked their imaginations. One evening, as John was working in the newer barn, he heard a faint sound. It was barely audible, like a distant whisper carried on the wind. He paused, listening intently. The whispering grew louder, more insistent, yet he couldn't make out the words. It was as if multiple voices were speaking at once, their tones urgent and pleading. "Who's there?" John called out, his voice echoing in the barn. There was no response, only the rustling of the hay and the creaking of the old wood. He shook his head, chalking it up to his imagination, and resumed his work. But that night, as he lay in bed next to Sarah, he couldn't shake the feeling that something was watching them. The whispers he had heard in the barn seemed to follow him into his dreams, filling his sleep with images of fire and shadowy figures. The next morning, Sarah found John standing at the kitchen window, staring out at the charred remains of the original barn. "Are you okay?" she asked, placing a hand on his shoulder. John turned to her, his expression troubled. "I heard something in the barn last night. Voices. They were strange." Sarah frowned. "What kind of voices?" "I don't know. It was like they were trying to tell me something, but I couldn't understand them." "Maybe it's just the stress of the move," Sarah suggested, trying to sound reassuring. "We're all tired. Let's take it easy today." John nodded, but the unease lingered. As the days turned into weeks, the strange occurrences became more frequent. Emily complained of cold spots in her room, and Ben spoke of shadows that moved on their own. Sarah found herself waking up in the middle of the night, convinced she heard footsteps outside their bedroom door. The whispers in the wind grew louder, more distinct, and John began to piece together fragments of their messages. They spoke of fire, of betrayal, and of lives lost too soon. And as he stood once more before the ruins of the original barn, he felt a chill run down his spine. The past, it seemed, was not ready to rest. As the first frost of the season settled over the farm, the Millers found themselves grappling with an increasingly unsettling atmosphere. The strange occurrences that had initially seemed like the figments of tired minds were now impossible to ignore. John had grown accustomed to the disembodied whispers that seemed to follow him wherever he went, and Sarah often felt an icy presence trailing her steps. One particularly cold evening, the family gathered around the fireplace, trying to ward off the chill that seemed to seep through the very walls of their home. John glanced at his children, noting the shadows under their eyes. "Everyone's a bit tired tonight," he said, attempting to sound casual. "Why don't we turn in early?" Emily, curled up with a blanket on the couch, looked up at her father. "Dad, do you think this place is haunted?" John exchanged a glance with Sarah, who gave a slight nod. They had decided not to keep secrets from the kids. "I don't know, sweetheart, but I do think something strange is going on. We'll figure it out together." Ben, who had been unusually quiet, piped up. "I heard a man crying last night. It came from the old barn." Sarah pulled her son close, her expression a mix of concern and determination. "We'll get to the bottom of this," she promised. The next day, John took a trip into town to speak with the locals. At the general store, he struck up a conversation with Mr. Thompson, an elderly man who had lived in the area all his life. When John mentioned the old barn, Mr. Thompson's expression darkened. "That barn's got a history, all right," Mr. Thompson said, his voice low. "Burned down nearly a century ago. Folks say it was no accident. Rumor has it there was a fight over land ownership. A man and his 2 sons died in that fire, trapped inside. Since then, anyone who's tried to rebuild there has had problems." John's heart sank. "What kind of problems?" Mr. Thompson leaned in, his eyes glinting with a mix of fear and intrigue. "Strange noises, objects moving on their own, and worse. Some say the spirits of those men never left. They're stuck there, bound by anger and sorrow." John left the store with a heavy heart, the weight of the farm's history pressing down on him. That evening, he shared what he'd learned with Sarah, Emily, and Ben. The family listened in silence, the gravity of their situation sinking in. "We need to do something," Emily said, her voice trembling. "We can't just live like this." John nodded. "We'll start by trying to understand what these spirits want. Maybe we can help them find peace." As the days turned into weeks, the Miller family became increasingly attuned to the supernatural phenomena around them. The whispers grew louder, often forming coherent words and phrases that spoke of betrayal and injustice. John kept a journal, documenting every encounter and trying to piece together the tragic story of the barn's fiery past. One windy night, as the family sat down for dinner, a sudden gust blew through the house, extinguishing the candles and plunging them into darkness. The whispers rose to a cacophony, filling the room with desperate, pleading voices. Sarah clutched John's hand, her eyes wide with fear. "Listen," John whispered, straining to make out the words. "They're trying to tell us something." The voices seemed to converge, forming a single haunting sentence. "Justice for the lost." Emily's eyes filled with tears. "What do they mean, Dad?" John shook his head, feeling a chill run down his spine. "I don't know, but we need to find out. Whatever happened here, these spirits won't rest until justice is served." Determined to uncover the truth, the Millers delved deeper into the history of their farm. They visited the local library, combing through old newspapers and records. What they discovered was a tale of greed and betrayal that had culminated in a deadly inferno. The barn had been the center of a bitter dispute between two families, the McAllisters and the Rutherfords. Accusations of land theft and foul play had escalated, leading to a violent confrontation that ended in flames. The fire had claimed the lives of the McAllister patriarch and his two sons, while the Rutherfords had vanished, leaving behind a legacy of suspicion and unanswered questions. Armed with this knowledge, the Millers knew their task was far from over. The spirits of the McAllisters were crying out for justice, and it was up to the living to set things right. The whispers in the wind had become a call to action, urging them to uncover the full truth and finally bring peace to the restless souls that haunted their home. As they prepared for the challenges ahead, the Miller family steeled themselves for the journey into the past, knowing that only by confronting the darkness of history could they hope to reclaim their future. The Millers were determined to help the restless spirits find peace, but the resolve was about to be tested. One cold, moonlit night, John Miller had his first direct encounter with the supernatural. John was in the newer barn, repairing a broken stall door. The wind outside had picked up, making the wooden structure creak and groan. He was used to the sounds by now, having spent many late nights working to restore the farm to its former glory. But tonight, the atmosphere felt different, charged with an eerie tension. As he hammered the final nail into place, John heard a faint noise behind him, a soft whispering that seemed to rise and fall with the wind. He paused, straining to listen, but the whispering stopped. Shaking his head, he returned to his work, but the unease lingered. Moments later, the whispering returned, louder this time. John turned, peering into the shadows of the barn. "Is someone there?" he called out, his voice echoing off the walls. At first, there was no response. Then, slowly, a figure began to materialize in the dim light. A translucent, ghostly form of a man, his eyes hollow and filled with sorrow. John's heart pounded in his chest as he took a step back, nearly dropping his hammer. The apparition moved closer, its features becoming clearer. It was the ghost of a young farmhand, his clothes scorched and tattered. His lips moved, but the words were barely audible. "Justice for the lost." John felt a chill run down his spine. "What do you want?" he whispered. The ghostly farmhand raised a hand, pointing towards the ruins of the old barn. "Find the truth. Bring justice." Before John could respond, the apparition faded away, leaving him standing alone in the barn, the weight of its message pressing heavily on his mind. That night, John couldn't sleep. The encounter replayed in his mind, the ghost's sorrowful eyes haunting his thoughts. He had to tell Sarah. Maybe together, they could decipher the meaning behind the spirit's words. The next morning, over breakfast, John shared his experience with Sarah and the children. Emily and Ben listened with wide eyes, their expressions a mix of fear and fascination. "I saw him, Sarah," John said, his voice trembling. "He was trying to tell me something about justice for the lost." Sarah reached across the table, squeezing his hand. "We'll figure this out, John. Whatever it takes, we'll help them find peace." Determined to understand more about the tragedy that had occurred on their land, the Millers decided to visit the town historian, Mrs. Cartwright. She was known for her extensive knowledge of the area's past and had a reputation for being a bit eccentric. They found Mrs. Cartwright in her cluttered, book-filled house. She greeted them warmly and listened intently as John recounted his encounter with the ghostly farmhand. "Ah, the McAllister farm," Mrs. Cartwright said, nodding thoughtfully. "A tragic story indeed. The McAllisters were good people, hard-working and kind. But the land dispute with the Rutherfords turned deadly. The fire that destroyed the barn was no accident, and the McAllisters were trapped inside. John leaned forward. "Do you know anything about the ghosts? How can we help them?" Mrs. Cartwright's expression grew somber. "The spirits of the McAllisters are bound to this place by their unresolved pain and the injustice of their deaths. To help them, you must uncover the full truth of what happened and bring the responsible parties to justice." With a newfound sense of purpose, the Millers returned home, ready to continue their investigation. They spent days combing through old records and talking to anyone who might have information about the McAllisters and the Rutherfords. The more they learned, the clearer it became that the fire had been a deliberate act of arson, intended to drive the McAllisters off their land. One evening, as John was reviewing his notes in the kitchen, he heard the faint whispering again. This time it was coming from the living room. He followed the sound, his heart pounding. As he entered the room, he saw the ghostly farmhand standing by the window, gazing out at the ruins of the old barn. The ghost turned to John, its eyes filled with a deep sadness. "The truth is buried in the ashes." John nodded, understanding what needed to be done. "We'll find it," he promised. "We'll find the truth and bring justice for the lost." The apparition faded away, leaving John with a renewed sense of determination. The next morning he gathered the family and explained their next step. They needed to search the ruins of the old barn for any clues that might have been overlooked. With shovels and flashlights in hand, the Millers made their way to the charred remains of the original barn. As they sifted through the ashes and debris, they uncovered fragments of the past, burnt tools, remnants of wooden beams, and finally, a small metal box buried deep in the ground. John carefully pried open the box, revealing its contents: a collection of letters and documents that detailed the land dispute and the mounting tension between the McAllisters and the Rutherfords. Among the papers was a letter from the night of the fire, written by the McAllister patriarch. It spoke of threats from the Rutherfords and a desperate plea for help that had gone unanswered. Tears filled Sarah's eyes as she read the letter aloud. "This is the proof we need," she said, her voice choked with emotion. "The proof that the fire was no accident." As the sun set over the farm, casting long shadows across the land, the Millers knew their journey was far from over. They had uncovered the truth, but justice still needed to be served. The restless spirits of the McAllisters would not find peace until those responsible for their deaths were held accountable. With the evidence in hand, the Millers prepared to face whatever challenges lay ahead, determined to bring justice to the lost and finally put the ghosts of the past to rest. The discovery of the metal box and its damning contents had set the Miller family on a determined course. They now had the evidence to prove the McAllisters had been wronged, but there was still more to uncover. The restless spirits demanded closure, and the Millers were determined to provide it. John had taken to visiting the local library frequently, sifting through archives and old newspapers, while Sarah delved into town records. Their evenings were spent comparing notes, trying to piece together a clearer picture of the events leading up to the fateful fire. One rainy afternoon, as John pored over a stack of yellowed newspapers, an article caught his eye. It was a small piece, buried deep within the pages, dated just a few days after the fire. It mentioned a journal belonging to the previous owner of the farm, believed to contain details about the land dispute. The journal had never been found, but it was rumored to hold key information about the night of the fire. John's heart raced as he read the article. If they could find that journal, it might provide the final piece of the puzzle. He hurried home to share his discovery with Sarah and the children. "Sarah, we need to find that journal," John said as he entered the house, dripping from the rain. "It might have the answers we need." Sarah nodded, her expression resolute. "Where do we even start looking?" John thought for a moment. The article mentioned that the journal was kept in the farmhouse. It could still be here, somewhere. The family spent the next few days searching every nook and cranny of the old house. They emptied closets, pulled up floorboards, and inspected the attic thoroughly. Their efforts seemed fruitless until one evening, Emily made a discovery. "Dad! Mom! Come here!" Emily's voice echoed down the hallway. John and Sarah rushed to Emily's room to find her holding a dusty, leather-bound journal. She had found it tucked away behind a loose panel in the wall. John carefully took the journal from Emily, his hands trembling with anticipation. They gathered around the kitchen table as John opened the journal, its pages brittle with age. The entries detailed the daily life on the farm, the growing tension with the Rutherfords, and finally, the night of the fire. As John read aloud, the words painted a vivid picture of fear and desperation. The journal spoke of threats made by the Rutherfords, the McAllisters' attempts to seek help, and the horrifying night when the barn was set ablaze. The final entry was a haunting plea for justice, written mere hours before the fire consumed the barn and claimed the lives of the McAllister men. Tears welled up in Sarah's eyes as John finished reading. "This is it. This is what we need to bring their story to light," she said, her voice breaking. John nodded. "We have to take this to the authorities. It's time the truth was known." The next day, armed with the journal and the letters from the metal box, John and Sarah went to the local police station. They presented their findings to Sheriff Daniels, a stern but fair man who listened intently as they recounted the tragic history of their farm. "This is some serious evidence," Sheriff Daniels said, flipping through the pages of the journal. "If what you're saying is true, the Rutherfords have a lot to answer for. I'll launch an investigation and see what we can uncover." The days that followed were filled with anxious waiting. Sheriff Daniels and his team worked tirelessly, interviewing old-timers who remembered the McAllisters and examining the evidence provided by the Millers. The townsfolk, too, were abuzz with talk of the haunting and the tragic history that had resurfaced after so many years. One evening, as the Millers sat in their living room, the familiar whispers returned, filling the room with a sense of urgency. The ghostly farmhand appeared once more, his eyes locked onto John's. "The truth is close. Justice near." John stood up, his heart pounding. "We're doing everything we can. The sheriff is investigating. We'll get justice for you." The apparition nodded slowly before fading away, leaving a sense of calm in its wake. A week later, Sheriff Daniels visited the Miller farm. He had news. "We've corroborated your findings with old records and witness statements," he said. "The evidence points to foul play. The Rutherfords were indeed responsible for the fire. We're moving forward with charges against the surviving members of the Rutherford family." The Millers felt a wave of relief wash over them. The truth was finally coming to light, and justice was within reach. That night, as they gathered around the fireplace, the atmosphere in the house felt different, lighter, as if a great burden had been lifted. But the journey was not yet over. The spirits of the McAllisters had been heard, but they still needed to be laid to rest. The Miller family knew they had one final task: to hold a proper ceremony to honor the McAllisters and offer them the peace they so desperately sought. With the town's support, the Millers organized a memorial service at the site of the old barn. As they stood together under the clear night sky, surrounded by friends and neighbors, they felt a sense of closure. The whispers in the wind had become a gentle breeze, carrying with it a promise of peace and the hope of a new beginning. Despite the strides the Millers had made in uncovering the truth and bringing the Rutherfords to justice, the spirits of the McAllisters remained restless. Strange occurrences continued to plague the farm, and the family knew they needed to take one final step to help the souls find peace. They decided to invite a psychic to perform a seance, hoping to communicate directly with the spirits and offer them the closure they so desperately needed. The Millers contacted Madame Serena, a renowned psychic known for her ability to connect with the spirit world. She arrived at the farmhouse on a dark, stormy evening, her presence bringing an air of mystique and anticipation. "Thank you for coming, Madame Serena," John said, shaking her hand. Madame Serena nodded, her eyes glinting with a mixture of curiosity and concern. "I've heard about your plight. Let's see if we can help these spirits find the peace they seek." The family gathered around the dining table, which Madame Serena had prepared with candles, crystals, and a small mirror. She instructed them to hold hands and close their eyes, focusing on the spirits they wished to contact. As Madame Serena began to chant in a low, melodic voice, the room grew colder, and the flickering candle flame stretched towards the ceiling. The air felt thick with anticipation, and the Millers could hear the faint whispers of the spirits growing louder. "Spirits of the McAllisters, we call upon you," Madame Serena intoned. "Come forth and speak with us. Share your pain so we may help you find peace." For a moment there was silence. Then the temperature in the room dropped sharply, and the candles flickered wildly. The small mirror on the table fogged up, and the faint outline of a handprint appeared on its surface. Suddenly, the room was filled with a cacophony of voices, overlapping and urgent. The Millers gripped each other's hands tighter as the voices grew louder, more desperate. Madame Serena's eyes rolled back, and she began to speak in a voice that was not her own. A deep, sorrowful voice filled with anguish. "They betrayed us, trapped us, burned us alive. We seek justice. We seek peace." John's heart pounded in his chest. "We've uncovered the truth. The Rutherfords are being brought to justice. What more can we do to help you find peace?" The voices continued to swell, their intensity growing. Madame Serena's body convulsed, and the candles on the table were snuffed out, plunging the room into darkness. The Millers could feel the presence of the spirits all around them, a tangible force of sorrow and anger. "Please," Sarah pleaded, her voice trembling, "tell us how we can help you." The mirror on the table suddenly shattered, and a single word echoed through the room, clear and unmistakable. "Revenge." Madame Serena collapsed, the connection severed, and the room fell silent. The Millers rushed to her side, helping her to a chair. She looked up at them, her face pale and drawn. "The spirits are deeply tormented," she said, her voice weak. "They want more than justice. They want revenge." John felt a knot of dread tighten in his stomach. "What does that mean for us?" Madame Serena shook her head. "I'm not sure, but their desire for revenge is strong. You must be careful. The spirits are not at peace, and their anger could manifest in dangerous ways." As the storm raged outside, the Millers sat in the dimly lit room, grappling with the revelation. They had hoped to bring peace to the spirits, but instead, they had awakened a darker force, one that demanded retribution. The next few days were tense. The strange occurrences around the farm intensified. Objects moved on their own, doors slammed shut, and the whispers of the spirits became more menacing. The once peaceful farmhouse now felt like a battleground between the living and the dead. One evening, as John and Sarah discussed their next steps, a sudden gust of wind blew through the house, extinguishing the lights. The whispers grew louder, and the temperature dropped sharply. The ghostly farmhand appeared before them, his eyes filled with fury. "You promised justice," the spirit hissed. "But justice is not enough. We want revenge." John stood his ground, his heart pounding. "We've done everything we can to bring the truth to light. What more do you want from us?" The ghostly figure pointed towards the old barn, its eyes burning with an otherworldly fire. "The blood of the Rutherfords. Only then will we rest." The spirit vanished, leaving John and Sarah in the dark, cold room. They looked at each other, the weight of the spirit's demand heavy on their hearts. "We can't do that," Sarah whispered, tears in her eyes. "We can't take revenge into our own hands." John nodded, his mind racing. "There has to be another way. We need to find a way to calm these spirits without resorting to violence." Determined to find an alternative, the Millers began researching rituals and ceremonies that might help appease the vengeful spirits. They consulted with other psychics, spiritual leaders, and even local folklore experts, hoping to find a solution that would bring peace to the McAllisters without causing harm. As the days turned into weeks, the tension on the farm remained high. The spirits' demands for revenge loomed over the Millers, a dark cloud that threatened to consume them. But despite the fear and uncertainty, they held on to hope. They believed there had to be a way to bring justice and peace without succumbing to the darkness of revenge. The Millers knew their journey was far from over. The seance had revealed the depths of the spirit's torment, and the path to peace was fraught with danger. But with determination and compassion, they continued their quest, seeking a resolution that would honor the lost and protect the living. The Miller family's efforts to bring peace to the spirits of the McAllisters took a dark turn as the demands for revenge grew more insistent. The tension on the farm was palpable, and the strange occurrences became more aggressive. Objects were not just moved, but thrown across rooms. Doors were not just shut, but slammed with a force that rattled the entire house. One night, the already fraught atmosphere escalated to a new level of terror. It began with Ben, the youngest member of the Miller family, waking up screaming in the middle of the night. His cries were shrill and filled with a terror that sent chills down John and Sarah's spines. John rushed to Ben's room, Sarah close behind. They found their son thrashing on his bed, his eyes wide open but unseeing, his mouth forming words that were not his own. "They burned us, trapped us. Vengeance," Ben muttered in a deep, guttural voice that sounded nothing like him. "Ben!" Sarah cried, trying to shake him awake. "Ben, wake up! It's just a nightmare!" But Ben's eyes remained unfocused, his body rigid. John grabbed his son, holding him tightly, trying to break through whatever had a hold on him. "Ben, it's Dad. Come back to us, son." After what felt like an eternity, Ben's body went limp, and his eyes fluttered closed. He fell into a deep, uneasy sleep, his breathing heavy and labored. John and Sarah exchanged worried glances, their fear for their son palpable. The next morning, Ben seemed normal, but he had no memory of the previous night's events. Emily, however, was deeply disturbed. "I heard him, Dad," she said, her voice trembling. It was like someone else was speaking through him. John nodded, his face grim. "I think you're right, Emily. The spirits are getting stronger, and they're starting to affect us directly." Determined to protect their family, John and Sarah sought out the help of Dr. Samuel Harris, a renowned parapsychologist who had experience dealing with powerful hauntings and possessions. Dr. Harris agreed to come to the farm and assess the situation. When Dr. Harris arrived, he immediately sensed the oppressive energy in the house. He conducted a thorough investigation, using a variety of instruments to measure electromagnetic fields and other anomalies. His face grew more serious with each reading. "You have a very powerful haunting here," Dr. Harris said, sitting down with the family in their living room. "The spirits are not just attached to this place. They are actively seeking something, and their desire for revenge is giving them strength." Sarah clutched John's hand, her eyes filled with worry. "What can we do? Our son, he was possessed last night. We can't let this continue." Dr. Harris nodded. "Possession is a sign that the spirits are desperate and willing to take drastic measures. We need to find a way to appease them without giving in to their demands for revenge." He suggested a cleansing ritual, one that would involve the entire family and focus on healing and forgiveness rather than anger and retribution. The Millers agreed, hoping that this would be the key to finally bringing peace to the spirits and safety to their home. The ritual was set for the following night. Dr. Harris instructed the Millers to gather personal items that held positive energy and memories. They also collected herbs and salts known for their cleansing properties, which Dr. Harris spread around the house, focusing on the old barn where the fire had occurred. As the sun set and darkness enveloped the farm, the family gathered in the living room with Dr. Harris. They formed a circle, holding hands, while Dr. Harris chanted an incantation designed to cleanse the house of negative energy and offer peace to the spirits. The air grew thick with tension, and the temperature dropped sharply. The candles flickered, casting eerie shadows on the walls. The whispers of the spirits grew louder, more insistent, as if they were fighting against the ritual. Suddenly, Ben's body went rigid, and his eyes rolled back. He spoke in the same guttural voice as before. "You cannot deny us. We demand vengeance." John tightened his grip on Ben's hand. "We will not give in to revenge. We seek peace, for you and for us." Dr. Harris continued chanting, his voice steady and strong. The room filled with a bright light, and the spirits' voices grew louder, almost deafening. But the Millers held firm, focusing on their love for each other and their desire to bring peace to the tormented souls. The light intensified, and with a final powerful surge, it seemed to explode outward, filling every corner of the house. The whispers ceased, replaced by a profound silence. Ben's body relaxed, and he slumped into his father's arms, exhausted but peaceful. Dr. Harris looked around, his expression relieved. "I think it worked. The spirits have been calmed for now." The family sat in silence, absorbing the stillness that had settled over the house. It felt like a weight had been lifted, and for the first time in weeks, they felt a glimmer of hope. But they knew their journey wasn't over. The spirits had been calmed, but they had not yet been fully appeased. The Millers were determined to continue their quest for a peaceful resolution, one that would honor the lost and protect the living. As they prepared for bed that night, John looked out at the old barn, its ruins standing silent in the moonlight. He knew they had come a long way, but the final confrontation with the spirits still lay ahead, and he was ready to face whatever came next, with his family by his side. The Miller family felt a temporary sense of relief after the cleansing ritual, but they knew the respite was fragile. The spirits had been calmed, not appeased, and their demand for vengeance lingered like a dark cloud over the farm. Determined to find a way to bring lasting peace to the McAllisters, John and Sarah decided to delve deeper into the history of the barn fire. John spent hours combing through the journal they had found, looking for any overlooked details. One entry, in particular, caught his attention. It was a cryptic note from the McAllister patriarch, written just days before the fire. "The truth lies buried, deep within the land. Only justice can unearth it." Inspired by these words, John and Sarah decided to explore the property more thoroughly. They hoped to uncover any physical evidence that might have been hidden, clues that could reveal the full extent of the betrayal, and perhaps even identify any surviving witnesses who could provide more information. One sunny afternoon, John, Sarah, and the kids walked the property, methodically searching for anything that seemed out of place. As they approached the ruins of the old barn, Emily noticed something unusual near a large weathered tree at the edge of the property. "Dad, look at this," Emily called out, pointing to a patch of disturbed earth. John knelt down, examining the ground. It appeared that something had been buried there recently, or perhaps it had been disturbed by the weather over the years. "Grab the shovels," he said, feeling a surge of anticipation. The family worked together, digging carefully until they uncovered a small, rusted metal box. John pried it open, revealing a collection of letters and photographs, along with a map of the property. As they sifted through the contents, they found letters that detailed secret meetings between the McAllisters and the Rutherfords, negotiations over the disputed land, and threats that had been exchanged. One letter in particular stood out. It was written by James Rutherford, admitting to the arson and expressing his regret for the deaths caused by his act. "This is it," Sarah said, her voice trembling. "This is the proof we need." John nodded, a determined look in his eyes. "We have to take this to Sheriff Daniels. This could finally bring justice to the McAllisters and help lay their spirits to rest." The next day, they met with Sheriff Daniels, presenting the newly discovered evidence. The sheriff examined the letters and the map, his expression growing more serious by the minute. "This is powerful evidence," he said. "We'll reopen the investigation and see that justice is done." With the new evidence in hand, the authorities launched a more thorough investigation. They questioned surviving members of the Rutherford family and other old-timers who had lived in the area during the time of the fire. Slowly but surely, a clearer picture of the events leading up to the tragedy emerged. The McAllisters had been set up by the Rutherfords, who were desperate to gain control of the land. The fire had been a ruthless attempt to drive the McAllisters away, but it had gone horribly wrong, resulting in their deaths. The surviving Rutherfords had kept the truth hidden, allowing the McAllister spirits to remain trapped in a cycle of pain and vengeance. As the investigation progressed, the Miller family noticed a shift in the atmosphere at the farm. The oppressive feeling that had weighed on them for so long began to lift, and the strange occurrences became less frequent. The spirits seemed to sense that justice was finally within reach. One evening, as they gathered around the dining table, a soft, warm breeze wafted through the open window. It carried with it a faint, comforting whisper that seemed to echo with gratitude. John looked at his family, a hopeful smile on his face. "I think we're getting closer," he said. The following weeks brought more revelations. The Rutherfords' descendants were brought to trial, and the truth of the arson was publicly acknowledged. The town rallied behind the Miller family, grateful for their perseverance in uncovering the dark chapter of their history. With justice served, the Millers knew it was time to hold a final ceremony to honor the McAllisters and offer them the peace they deserved. They planned a memorial service at the site of the old barn, inviting the townsfolk to join them in paying their respects. On the day of the ceremony, the sun shone brightly, casting a warm glow over the farm. The townspeople gathered, offering words of support and solidarity. The Millers stood together, feeling the weight of the past lifting from their shoulders. John stepped forward, holding a candle. "We stand here today to honor the memory of the McAllister family," he began, his voice steady and strong. "We acknowledge the pain they suffered and the injustice they endured. Today, we bring the truth to light and offer them the peace they so rightly deserve." As John lit the candle, A gentle breeze stirred, carrying with it the soft, reassuring whispers of the spirits. The Millers felt a profound sense of closure, knowing they had fulfilled their promise to the McAllisters. That night, as they sat on the porch, gazing at the stars, the farm felt different. The air was lighter, the shadows less menacing. The whispers in the wind had finally ceased, replaced by a peaceful silence. The Miller family had faced unimaginable challenges, but their determination and compassion had prevailed. They had uncovered the truth, brought justice to the lost, and reclaimed their home from the grip of the past. And in doing so, they had forged a bond that would endure, a testament to the power of love and the unyielding quest for peace. With the truth about the McAllisters finally uncovered and justice served, the Miller family hoped they had seen the end of their supernatural ordeal. But the spirit's anger had not entirely dissipated. The McAllister spirit seemed more at peace, yet the presence of darker, more malevolent entities began to make themselves known. These spirits, feeding on the remaining energy of anger and revenge, were not ready to let go. One night, as a thunderstorm raged outside, John woke to the sound of footsteps echoing through the house. He sat up in bed, straining to listen. The footsteps grew louder, more purposeful, until they stopped right outside the bedroom door. "Sarah, wake up," John whispered, shaking his wife. Sarah groggily opened her eyes. "What is it?" "Listen," John said, his voice tight with fear. Sarah sat up, her eyes widening as she heard the footsteps. Suddenly, the door burst open, and a cold, dark figure stood in the doorway, its eyes glowing with a malevolent light. "Get out!" John shouted, grabbing the nearest object, a lamp, and hurling it at the figure. The lamp passed through the spirit, shattering against the wall. The figure moved into the room, its presence suffocating. John and Sarah scrambled out of bed, but the spirit reached out, its icy fingers grazing Sarah's arm. She screamed, collapsing to the floor as a searing pain shot through her body. Emily and Ben rushed into the room, their faces pale with fear. "Dad, what's happening?" Emily cried. "Get out of the house!" John yelled. "Now!" The family fled downstairs, but the house seemed to come alive with dark energy. Doors slammed shut, windows rattled, and the air was filled with the sounds of ghostly wails. The malevolent spirits had awakened, and they were furious. John led his family outside, the rain pouring down in sheets. They huddled together on the porch, gasping for breath. "We need to leave," John said, his voice shaking. "We can't stay here." "But where will we go?" Sarah asked, clutching her arm where the spirit had touched her. "We'll figure it out," John replied. "But right now, we need to get away from this place." As they made their way to the car, the spirits followed them, their whispers growing louder, more insistent. "You cannot escape. We are bound. You must suffer." The car roared to life and John sped down the dirt road, the farmhouse disappearing into the stormy night. They drove to the nearest town, seeking refuge in a small motel. Exhausted and terrified, the family huddled together, hoping the spirits would not follow them. The next morning, they contacted Dr. Harris, explaining the events of the previous night. The parapsychologist arrived at the motel, his face grave as he listened to their story. "The spirits you encountered are not the McAllisters," Dr. Harris said. "They are darker entities, drawn to the residual energy of anger and pain. They are feeding on it, growing stronger." "What can we do?" Sarah asked, her voice filled with desperation. "We can't go back there." Dr. Harris nodded. "We need to perform a more powerful cleansing ritual, one that will banish these entities for good. but it will be dangerous. These spirits will fight back." Determined to reclaim their home, the Millers agreed to the plan. They returned to the farmhouse with Dr. Harris, who brought with him an array of protective charms, herbs, and candles. He instructed the family to form a circle in the living room, each holding a lit candle. "This ritual will require all of your strength and resolve," Dr. Harris said. "Focus on the love and light within you. We must drive out the darkness." As Dr. Harris began to chant, the temperature in the room plummeted, and the air grew thick with malevolent energy. The spirits materialized, their forms shifting and writhing, their faces contorted with rage. "You cannot banish us," they hissed. "We will consume you." The Millers held firm, their candles burning brightly. Dr. Harris's chant grew louder, more forceful, and the spirits screamed in fury, their forms flickering like shadows in the wind. Suddenly, one of the spirits lunged at Emily, knocking her candle from her hand. The flame sputtered out, and Emily fell to the floor, gasping for breath. "Emily!" Sarah cried, reaching for her daughter. Dr. Harris quickly stepped forward, placing a protective charm on Emily. "Hold on, Emily. Stay strong." Emily nodded, her eyes filled with determination. She relit her candle, the flame burning even brighter than before. The spirits howled in rage, their forms becoming more indistinct. The light from the candles seemed to push them back, their dark energy waning. With a final deafening roar, the spirits dissipated, leaving the room in a stunned silence. Dr. Harris collapsed into a chair, his face pale and drawn. "It's done," he said. "The spirits are gone." The Millers looked at each other, a mix of relief and exhaustion washing over them. They had faced unimaginable terror and had emerged victorious. Their home was finally free of the malevolent entities that had plagued them. As they stood together, the first rays of dawn breaking through the storm clouds, John felt a deep sense of gratitude. They had survived the battle, and their family was stronger for it. But they knew they had one final task: to honor the spirits of the McAllisters and ensure their peace. With Dr. Harris's guidance, they planned a final ceremony to cleanse the land and offer their thanks. The Millers were ready to bring closure to their journey and begin anew, their bond unbreakable and their spirits unyielding. The Millers knew that the battle was not entirely won. Though they had banished the malevolent entities, the spirits of the McAllisters remained, still yearning for a resolution that had eluded them for nearly a century. The family prepared for a final confrontation, a climactic showdown that would determine whether the spirits could finally find peace. Dr. Harris, who had become a steadfast ally, agreed to guide them through this final phase. "We need to return to the site of the original barn," he explained. "That's where their spirits are strongest, and it's where we can help them find the peace they deserve." The Millers and Dr. Harris prepared for the ceremony with careful precision. They gathered personal items, letters, and photographs that had once belonged to the McAllisters. They also collected offerings, candles, herbs, and flowers to honor the spirits. As the sun set on the appointed evening, casting long shadows across the farm, the family made their way to the ruins of the old barn. The air was thick with anticipation, and a cold wind rustled the leaves, carrying with it the faint whispers of the past. They arranged the offerings in a circle and lit the candles, their flickering flames casting an eerie glow over the charred remains. Dr. Harris stood at the center, his voice strong and steady as he began the ritual. "Spirits of the McAllisters, we call upon you," he intoned. "We have uncovered the truth of your suffering and have sought justice in your name. Now, we offer you peace. Come forth and be heard." For a moment there was silence. Then, slowly, the figures of the McAllisters began to materialize within the circle, The father, his two sons, and the farmhand stood before them, their expressions a mix of sorrow and hope. John stepped forward, holding the letter they had found in the metal box. "We found this, along with your journal and other letters. We know what happened to you, and we've brought those responsible to justice. Please, find peace." The spirits looked at each other, their forms shimmering in the candlelight. The father stepped forward, his eyes filled with a deep sadness. "Justice has been served, but our souls are still bound by the betrayal and pain we endured." Dr. Harris nodded, understanding the depth of their torment. "We need to help them release their pain. Focus on the love and compassion you have for each other, and for these spirits." The Millers joined hands, their hearts united in their desire to help the McAllisters find peace. They closed their eyes and focused on the love that had carried them through this ordeal. The air around them grew warmer, the oppressive weight lifting as their collective energy filled the space. The spirits began to change, their forms becoming less distinct, their expressions softening. The father looked at John, his eyes filled with gratitude. "Thank you," he whispered. "You have given us hope." The farmhand stepped forward, his gaze fixed on Emily. "You have shown great courage and kindness. We can rest now, knowing our story will not be forgotten." The spirits began to fade, their forms dissolving into the night air. The wind carried their final whispers, a gentle promise of peace and gratitude. The candles flickered one last time before going out, leaving the family in darkness, but with a profound sense of closure. John looked at his family, their faces illuminated by the soft glow of the moon. "We did it," he said, his voice filled with emotion. "We helped them find peace." The Millers stood together, feeling the weight of the past finally lifting. The spirits of the McAllisters had found their rest, and the farm was once again a place of tranquility and hope. As they walked back to the farmhouse, the first light of dawn began to break over the horizon. The air was crisp and clear, and the oppressive atmosphere that had once pervaded the farm was gone. The Miller family had faced unimaginable challenges and had emerged stronger, their bond unbreakable and their spirits unyielding. In the days that followed, the farm flourished. The land seemed to come alive with new energy, the crops growing strong and healthy. The Millers felt a renewed sense of purpose, their hearts light with the knowledge that they had honored the past and could now look forward to the future. The whispers in the wind had finally ceased, replaced by the gentle rustle of leaves and the songs of birds. The Miller family had reclaimed their home from the grip of the past, forging a legacy of love, resilience, and unwavering determination. Their journey had been one of fear and darkness, but also of hope and redemption. And as they stood together, gazing out over the land they had fought so hard to protect, they knew that their story was far from over. The future was theirs to shape, and they would face it with the same strength and courage that had carried them through the darkest of nights.